It's almost as if we have to view things as two components to everything that we interact with. The first is the thing itself, and the second is the thing after we process it in our minds. Because it's the act of processing anything that comes to our attention in our mind that gives it shape, meaning, and therefore creates its reality.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Stephen Toboroff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toboroff, and today I want to explore in greater detail a subject that came up in my last episode in my conversation with Professor Brown regarding Stoic philosophy. There was a part of our conversation where Professor Brown and I were discussing Epictetus's thoughts on impressions. And for those who didn't listen to that episode, I would highly recommend listening to this episode, the prior one, because I think it's a very interesting discussion that Professor Brown and I have. But more to the point, for purposes of business, I think that the subject of impressions and how important they are and what they are and how we can interact with them is really vital for business. And I received a couple of emails on the subject. And so I want to explore it in greater detail from my perspective with much more focus on business and less on just the philosophical concepts in general. So in my interpretation, and again, I would highly recommend people both listen to that podcast, and I definitely think it's worthwhile for people in business, particularly if you're in a position of leadership, to expose yourself to some of the writings of Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, because I think Stoic philosophy is so actionable and so helpful, particularly for those in a position of authority and responsibility, that I really believe you'll give yourself some great insight and some great advantages if you do that. And so in the writings of Epictetus, he discusses impressions. And for purposes of our conversation, I'm going to define impressions as how we process information that comes to our attention. That information can be something static, such as a tree or a river or a painting, something that we would say simplistic, right? But even those things which are quite simple have a tremendous amount of deviation and variety, depending upon who perceives them, depending upon the mindset of the person that perceives them, and depending upon other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with the tree itself. So in our discussion, Professor Brown and I, in the last episode, we used an example of a tree. And Professor Brown made an excellent point where he said, look, if an arborist looks at a tree, they're not just going to see a tree, they're going to see a pine spruce that's in a stage of blossoming. And they're going to have all of this knowledge about the tree that is a direct reflection of their education and their experience. And so as they perceive the tree being the impression, they're going to have an entirely different reality, so to speak, than someone such as myself, who's not an arborist. And when I see a tree, I might say, wow, that's a beautiful set of leaves on the right side of that tree. And that color green reminds me of a t-shirt that I had when I was 8 years old. So the tree is reality. But that's a very sort of simple, but I think important example of how impressions can impact, and in the very act of impacting, create reality, right? Now that's impressions with respect to something that's static. But there are all kinds of stimuli that come at us that are not static, but that are dynamic. A conversation we have with someone, a request that somebody makes of us, a set of data regarding sales or marketing or inventory or receivables that come to our attention. They exist and they're real, but how we process that information is going to have a huge impact on the decisions that we make. And the decisions we make are, of course, probably our most important responsibility in business as business owners, business leaders, people in management position. And so the impression that I get from a conversation about somebody sharing with me a marketing strategy, or when I look at the accounts receivable, days outstanding, or whatever, the underlying information is pretty direct. But if I superimpose on that information my own biases, my own subconscious history, my own ignorance, it could be, well, that's going to create a reality that's not there. It's almost as if we have to view things as two components to everything that we interact with. The first is the thing itself, and the second is the thing after we process it in our minds, because it's the act of processing anything that comes to our attention in our mind that gives it shape, meaning, and therefore creates its reality. So now, in business, if somebody comes to me with a marketing strategy that says, look, Stephen, what you guys really want to do is explore Facebook ads in a way that you've never done before and try XYZ. If I listen to that and say, oh, Mark Zuckerberg, I don't like him, and I don't use Facebook, and my kids say Snapchat's good, and by the way, I don't like the way that social media has impacted society, and all these other discussions in my head have nothing to do with the content of what was said to me for purposes of business, right? And if I'm aware of that sort of secondary conversation going on in my mind, then I can check it and get back to basics, which is, okay, this person's an expert on digital marketing. They're telling me about Facebook ads. Let me explore this more deeply with them, show me the data, and start asking them quality questions. But if I'm not aware of what I'm doing internally, if I'm not aware of how I'm crafting my impression, well, am I really going to be able to make quality decisions, right? So it's a pretty simple concept to understand, but it's an important concept that we then begin to make a habit of auditing in ourselves. Meaning, as decision makers, I believe I would propose to the audience that it's very important that we not only look at information and have conversations and seek out answers, but that we always take a second to really ask ourselves, am I really focusing and processing on what's here, or am I adding anything to it? And is what I'm adding to it relevant or irrelevant? Because let's take the Facebook ad example again. Let's say that my background is in digital marketing. Let's say that 2 weeks ago, I happened to go to a lecture at the Harvard Business School. And at that lecture was a speaker who did an entire talk about Facebook ads. And in that talk, they mentioned that Facebook ads are particularly efficacious for retail products, but particularly ineffective for B2B solutions where you're in a tight regional area of selling. You're in a very discrete, clear marketplace. You know who your customers are. And in that dynamic, you don't want to use Facebook ads. You want to use different strategies. Well, if I bring that to the impression, then I would say that that's quite relevant. And so in that case, my impression is being created by actually relevant knowledge, which will then lead me to ask better questions. So this form of meta self-evaluation, and it can be done very quickly, I think is extraordinarily important. And I would also put forth that the more that we do it, not only will we make better decisions, but we can have a much more peaceful and enjoyable life. There's another section in Epictetus's discourses, and I'm paraphrasing here, where he talks about something that could cause an individual a disturbance. Maybe your child spills a glass of milk. Maybe a door is squeaking. Any of the countless things in life that occur, that if we attach significance to them, they can cause us some disquietude. And Epictetus says that the ability to ignore these things or the ability to not allow them to rise to the level of upsetting you is the price you pay for your mental equilibrium. And I think that is a derivative and another benefit of this sort of self-evaluation, because the point of the matter is that if we're not allowing ourselves to really access information in business, if we're not allowing ourselves to really process what's in front of us, and we're superimposing things on top of it, we're going to be creating problems for ourselves that we don't need to have. And conversely, we're going to be depriving ourselves of opportunities. So that's the first comment and set of sort of points that I want to make regarding impressions and my thoughts on the conversation last week. There's another element to this conversation that I want to introduce right now, which I think is quite helpful and something I've given a lot of thought to, because so often we get caught up in a paradigm, a set of beliefs that is actually not correct, but because it's so well established and so widely accepted, we don't challenge it. And so one of those paradigms that I see a lot, I see it on social media, and I think it's been there for quite a while, is that if you're not immediately engaged in something that is directly related to your business, and if you're not grinding nonstop in a directly transactionable and immediately relevant way to your business, you're actually wasting time and being ineffective. And I don't know that I agree with that, particularly for the person who's in the position of leadership. And I want to break that down into two chunks. And this also pertains to philosophy. Okay? So let's take the first part. If we accept that paradigm, and let's say that you're a butcher or an accountant or a pilot, then theoretically, to be really effective in what you do, you should do nothing but study those areas, read trade magazines, talk about those areas, be hyper-focused on those areas. And anything that you do outside of those areas is a waste of time, it's a distraction, and you're not being effective. And then the second thing is, if from the minute you wake up till the minute you go to bed, if you're not grinding in a directly transactional way to your task, if you're a butcher and you're not always in the butcher shop cutting meat or looking stuff up or et cetera, then you're also falling short. Now, on the one hand, I absolutely agree that you have to be obsessed with your goals. You have to be obsessed with what it is you want to accomplish. If you want to accomplish something difficult, it's going to require a tremendous amount of attention, tremendous amount of consistency, a tremendous amount of obsessive love. Like, I can honestly say that I think I'm thinking about my business in one way or another, in one derivative form or another, for a big percentage of my waking hours, because I love it, because I'm obsessed with it. I find business fascinating, and I find what we do here at Woolco particularly fascinating. But as fascinating as I find Woolco, I recognize that my responsibilities as a business leader require me to be capable of doing a number of different things that I need to learn or practice or explore in areas that are outside of the traditional transactional activities of business, most notably in the world of literature, philosophy, history, psychology, etc. Because, and this is where I really want to sort of focus for the remainder of this podcast, and was really the purpose of this podcast, because we talked about impressions, we talked about how they impact us and how we can be mindful of them to make it such that we make better decisions. But when things become much more complicated, and I would argue much more important, is when dealing with other people, when we start having conversations and discussions with people, because it's impossible to achieve anything of scale, at least I've found, without working with other people and communicating with other people. And so we talked about impressions. We briefly talked about utilizing other tools or other avenues of interest, activities. As I said, for me, it's reading, it's literature, it's philosophy, etc. For other people, it's meditation. For other people, it could be a variety of other things. But nonetheless, we talked about that as a way of expanding our mind and sort of reinforcing our interest and our effectiveness within our business. Because when we start getting involved with other people and communicating, we need to have all of those resources at our disposal. And so I want to talk about communication in business and tie it into all of this and just focus on the three primary conversations that you will have, at least that I have in business. It's either conversations with your team, your employees, conversations with existing customers, and conversations with prospective customers, people you'd like to onboard. There's also vendors, but whatever we discuss in the aforementioned three categories will certainly apply to vendors. Communication is essential in having a growing and functional business. I think it's also essential to have an enjoyable and constructive life. Because if we can't interact with people constructively and positively and in a beneficial manner, you can see how that would dramatically degrade our quality of life. So what does it take to have an effective conversation in business? I'm going to focus in business, of course, but this can be extrapolated to other contexts. Well, there are some key elements that are universal in conversation, and then we will go into the specific three subcategories that I mentioned. The first is, when you go into any conversation in business, you have to understand, and you have to understand from the beginning and really internalize, that this is transactional in nature. You're having a conversation to achieve an objective. Business is not the place for us to derive emotional nourishment. It's not the place for us to act out. It's not the place for us to feel heard and understood as a person. It's not the place for us to try to impose our emotions on other people or lure their emotions out of them for us. That's not appropriate. That's a lot of what happens in conversations in life with people. And in our personal lives, I suppose it can be tolerated. Business is transactional. So anytime you have a conversation, you should be first thinking to yourself, what is the objective that I'm looking to achieve here? What is my purpose? Why am I having this conversation? Sometimes you will initiate the conversation, in which case it should be very clear to you what it is that you want to achieve. Other times someone will initiate a discussion with you. At that point, you have to take a step back and say, this person's initiated this. I think I understand what their objective is. What is it that I want to get out of this now? So you have to establish in the beginning in your mind, what is your objective? The second thing is that to the extent that you can make yourself as calm as possible and as capable of listening as possible, that will set the table for a great business conversation. It starts with being an active listener. We talked earlier about impressions. What are impressions? We discussed this. It's when we take something that is real, a paperclip, a phone, a baseball hat. We look at it, of course it exists, but then we superimpose things on it. And that's the most simplistic iteration. Once we start getting involved with other human beings or groups of human beings, if you're having a meeting, things become much more complicated. So it's essential that in a business conversation at the beginning, once you've established your purpose, you calm yourself down, quiet yourself, if you will, and actively listen to the person with whom you're speaking. I always make it a practice to let the person speak uninterrupted. I also think it's an advantage if you let the other person speak first. Now, obviously, if you initiate a conversation, that's a different dynamic, and we'll get into that in a minute within the three subcategories. But when the other person is speaking, actively listen, don't interrupt, wait until they're finished, and then the third thing is for yourself, think before you speak. I have to reiterate this. Business is not the place to be freewheeling and thoughtless with your words and say whatever comes to mind or however you feel. It's not the place for that. Business is a place where things get done. Conversation is one of the currencies of business. You're not going to maximize that interaction or maximize the currency if you're being thoughtless and not thinking about what you want to say, what it is that you want to do. Once you've said what you want to say, I think it's incredibly important in business and valuable for there to be a understood clarity amongst the participants. So again, because it's business, if I have a conversation with somebody and I want to make sure that there's consensus, once I've made my point, once I've said what I have to say, I'll say, so that's where I'm coming from. Does that make sense? Do you agree with me? Are we on the same page here? If the person says, I understand what you're saying, we're on the same page, great, you have consensus. If the person says, I'm not clear on what you're saying there, you have an opportunity to repeat it because, again, you want to be clear. If the person says, I disagree, that's also great, terrific. What do you disagree with? But it's vital that in this business conversation that you're having, you get consensus. This is why I talked about and sort of tied it into those things that we do as business leaders that are not specifically related to our business. Because when you take the time to, in my case, what I like to do, whether it's, read great literature, philosophy, or psychology, it gives you a certain understanding of human interaction and relationships that is very valuable and is, of course, necessary in business, right? At least for me anyway. If I was not the type of person that was self-reflective, I don't think I would be as effective in communicating as I hope that I am. I understand how important it is to communicate effectively, and I understand how important it is to understand the person with whom I'm speaking, but that's not a knowledge that I have intuitively. It's a knowledge that can be gained. So that's why I wanted to have that preface. So those are basic beginning concepts of conversation. Now I want to go a little bit more granular and explore those concepts within the 3 primary conversations you will have in business. We're going to start with employees. In your organization, to the extent that your team is engaged and committed and clear-eyed in what they have to do, that's going to have an enormous impact on the type of success that you have, on the type of impact you have on others that you want to favorably impact within your business. So whenever I'm speaking to an employee, whether I initiate the conversation or they initiate one with me, the first thing I'm acutely aware of is that people want to be heard, particularly your employees. So if somebody has taken the time to come and reach out to me for a conversation about any aspect of business, a sales strategy, how we should handle a certain customer, whether we should onboard a new software solution, the first thing I want to do is listen attentively to the person so that they understand that they're being heard and that I respect where they're coming from. Not only does that instill a sense of self-esteem in people, which is very important, it's impossible for me to derive the value from the conversation if I don't, again, actively listen. So that's very important. A lot of times people think that if they're in a position of authority, that they have to do all the talking and superimpose things on other people. I think that's a very poor way of leading. I think it deprives you of a lot of benefits from your team, and I think it also puts you in a very adverse position when it comes to really getting the most out of people. So again, start with active listening. Second thing, if somebody's coming to me with an idea, with a concept, with a question, I ask a lot of questions. And I don't mind asking the same question multiple times if I haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. But I ask questions. And again, I didn't discuss this at the beginning, but I believe the appropriate tone to take with someone when you're speaking is a very calm, even-tempered, so to speak, soothing but clear tone of voice. Okay, so I ask a lot of questions. What do you mean by that? What will this be? What if we do this, that, or the other? What will the impact be on this? Not only is that going to, again, give me additional information, it's going to, again, make the person feel heard and respected because you're really leaning on their knowledge. Third, once my questions have been answered, if I need to do it at that moment, reach a decision. Susan, that's a phenomenal idea. I understand why you want to do this. I'm in agreement with you. when do we start executing? Or, Susan, that's an excellent idea. I still have to think about it. Let's circle back and discuss this again on Wednesday of next week. Or, Susan, I really appreciate you taking the time to give me your views on this. I'm processing it now. I have some reservations. I don't think this is something I want to pursue at this moment, but I will revisit it later. Whatever you do, acknowledge the person on your team who's taking the time to share information and get you involved in something. Again, language, conversation in business is a tool. It's there to achieve a purpose. If I initiate a conversation with someone on my team, an employee, the first thing I do, and this is something I learned from reading a book, and I'll share it with you guys, How to Win Friends and Influence People is one of the most important books I've ever read in business. I've read it a few times. I've thought about it a lot. There's a lot of very valuable lessons in it. And one of the things that Dale Carnegie suggests, and I agree with him, is when you're going to speak to an employee or anybody, but again, we're in business, and you have to make a criticism, assuming the person you're speaking with is a valued member of your team because they're still there, they're still working with you, they're still going to have an impact on your organization. It's always better if you're going to have to say something that's a criticism to begin with a positive. It's just the way that it is that people will be far more receptive. Now, there are some people who say to themselves, well, why should I have to soft soap it? Why should I have to do this? People should be mature. People should understand that I'm in the position of authority and I have to speak to them. Once you start saying should in relation to another person and how you think they should act, you've lost. Because each human being is individual and unique. And our should, back to impressions, is how we think things should be. We're superimposing something. But now we're not superimposing something on something as simplistic and benign as a tree. We're doing it on another human being that has their own aspirations, their own insecurities, their own objectives, their own perceptions. And so in that case, I think, again, objective, get something out of the conversation, transactional, make it as efficacious as possible. If it's established that beginning the conversation in the following way, John, thanks for coming down to my office. Really appreciate the effort you've been putting into the sales initiative you have going on. And really, appreciate it. You're doing a great effort here as you do with everything. The issue I have is the initiative is targeted to the wrong audience, in my opinion. And I'm going to tell you why I think that. That's very different than saying, John, this sales initiative is not working at all. Wrong people, total waste of time. Now, it's the same information, but you can understand how the person receiving that information is going to view it differently. And back to the very beginning of this discussion, we have to do everything in our power to facilitate a dynamic that is going to lead to the best possible outcome. So when you're speaking to an employee, my suggestion is if it's going to be a criticism, and we don't have to assign a pejorative sort of connotation to the word criticism. Criticism's a good thing. Being a critical thinker is good. Being an organization that is self-critical is good. But we want it to be constructive. So it always makes sense to start with something positive because, again, the person's on your team, they're trying to do the best. And then, as we said before, conclude the conversation by getting consensus. So anyway, we're in agreement. We're going to now target this new audience. We're going to start it on Wednesday. We're going to run it for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, we'll see how we do. Do you have any questions about that? Everything clear? We're good? Terrific. Now, some people say, well, why do you have to repeat things? Isn't it understood? Won't you come across as condescending? Again, in business, the purpose of conversation is to achieve an objective. It is inherently transactional. It is conversation with a purpose. I don't want to waste my time and the other person's time and have a misunderstanding. That's with employees. With customers, generally speaking, there's 2 reasons why you're speaking to a customer. Either they have an issue that they need resolved, /question, or you're looking to sell them additional goods and services. My suggestion when speaking to customers, particularly if they have an issue, could be a complaint, could be a question, could be anything. First, and one of the things that I used to always do, I don't do it as much because thank God we don't get a lot of customer complaints here because we're very hyper-focused on making sure that our customers are very satisfied, very well treated, that they understand how much we appreciate and respect them. But every now and again, something happens. And when it does, I used to get those calls to the extent that I could. And the way that I would handle it is I would let the customer speak uninterrupted. And then I would say, first of all, John, let me begin by thanking you for taking the time to call me, because you don't have to do that. And by doing it, you're giving me an opportunity to make it correct. I learned this lesson when I was in my 20s. I was working at Woolco in a customer service capacity while I was right before law school. And we had a great customer. It was a French restaurant. And the guy gave me his order and I made a mistake. He wanted tying twine. I gave him butcher twine or some such mistake. And he called back and he let me know that I made a mistake in what I interpreted as a very sort of, how should we say, unflattering, insulting manner. But this was my perception, of course. It really wasn't that insulting. He said, you shouldn't be doing customer service if you don't know what you're doing. And I've ordered this for years and I don't know how you can make a mistake on something so simple, but it's ridiculous and you can't do that again. So after he called me and I hung up the phone, I went to my father. I said, gosh, can you believe the way the guy talked to me? He said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, did you make a mistake? I said, I did. He said, do you understand that the easiest thing for this customer to do, because he pays his bills, it's a great restaurant, everybody would like him as a customer. The easiest thing for him to do is to just never order from us again. Doesn't have to call you, just stops ordering. You wouldn't know, and a month later, it's over, right? He, by calling you, is actually giving you an opportunity and is doing something positive, not the way you're interpreting it as a negative. And I thought about it. I said, you're right. I understand that. And that was a lesson that stayed with me. So whenever a customer takes the time to call, I thank them, because at the end of the day, they don't have to call us and tell us what we did wrong, or they don't have to call us and make suggestions on what they would like. They don't have to do that. So when they do, listen attentively, don't interrupt. Then I thank them. And then I say, okay, I've heard what you have to say. I appreciate your call, etc. Here's what we're going to do going forward. Tell them explicitly what you're going to do. I don't believe in excuses. If, God forbid, we made a mistake and we shipped the customer the wrong item, or if the truck showed up late, I'm not going to call them up and say, you wouldn't believe it. There was a new purchasing guy at the produce market and he sent us the wrong stuff. Or you wouldn't believe it. There was all this traffic and my driver didn't get to the warehouse. And no, that's called excuses. They don't want to hear that, nor should they have to hear that. What I say is, as I said, thank you for taking the time to give me the information. Totally unacceptable that happened. Here's what I'm going to do and make sure that everyone else in this organization does going forward to ensure that doesn't happen again. Does that work for you? Is that acceptable? Have I resolved this issue? If they say yes, great. If they haven't, say, no, you need to do this and this. But make sure you get that consensus again and then conclude the conversation by thanking them. It's almost the same thing if one of my salesmen or the sales team wants to sell a customer more products. We have over 10,000 items. Let's say that a customer is not buying any frozen items from us or any dairy. We begin by thanking them for the business they are giving us and the trust they're giving us. And then say, listen, I notice you're not buying this, that, or the other. Let me give you that as an opportunity to maybe save you some money, enhance the quality, whatever it is. But when speaking to customers, again, from just sort of the currency of conversation, vital to be an active listener, vital to demonstrate your respect and appreciation. Do not be one of these foolish companies. I've seen foolish people do things like, hey, you can't talk to me like that. I'm the owner of the company. I don't need this. That is the most weak and self-destructive and quite frankly, behavior that's worthy of zero respect. Because business is more than just money. Business is about trust and its relationships. If somebody has entrusted their business and the functioning of their business to you in a certain extent, it doesn't matter how big a customer they are, how big your business is, whatever. No. Within that dynamic, there's a moral obligation and mistakes can happen, but you can't absolve yourself of that by trying to leverage other nonsense. So with a customer, active listener, be very thankful, speak directly to what their issue is, get consensus, conclude by saying thank you. With a prospective customer, this is somebody we want to become a customer of Woolco. The best way to do that, and I don't want to get too sales-oriented here because this is really about, I was going to call it the art of conversation. Maybe it should be called that. but this is about just overall conversing and communicating with people efficaciously. But with a prospective customer, I think it's imperative, if you can, to give them the respect of sharing with you what their needs are first. That's one. And two, I believe it's imperative wherever possible, even with a prospective customer, even someone who may never actually become a full customer, to create value in that conversation. Because again, they're taking the time to speak with you. See, I don't like it when our sales team or salespeople in general immediately go into a patent pitch. That might be appropriate in certain instances. We're in a service business here, and this would be applicable for other services. Generally speaking, people will switch service companies or retain their service companies based upon pain points, problems, issues they're having. So when speaking with a prospective customer in our dynamic, first off, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Before I share with you anything about Woolco and what I believe are our attributes that are beneficial to anybody, I would love to learn more about your business. In particular, is there anything right now that's not working for you, that's not optimal, that needs to be done better? If you can get the prospective customer sharing that information with you, you can do several things. One, you make sure that you're speaking to them about something that's relevant to them. You're respecting their time. If the prospective customer tells you, yes, I have a big issue. For the fourth time this month, the truck has shown up 3 hours late, totally screws up my lunch prep. I can't live like this. If you guys can solve that and get your truck here without fail by 8, 9 o'clock the latest, that would be an immense help to me. So right there, we know what the issue is. Now, I could have wasted, or one of my sales team could have wasted this individual's time by talking about our pricing, our quality, our product selection. That's not the issue. So with a prospective customer, if you can get them to share with you what issues or pain points they're having, that's the best. Listen attentively. The main thing with prospective customers, and I say this to my sales team all the time, you have to be sincere. You have to speak the truth. I think there is a saying, it's called words from the heart enter the heart. Some people will say or do anything to get a sale. Totally stupid. Totally inappropriate, totally immoral. You need to listen to the prospective customer and answer the question as honestly and transparently as possible. So let's say the person said, I need this thing here religiously without fail by 5 a.m. Well, then the response would be like, look, we are very reliable with our deliveries and we can do a lot. I don't want to guarantee that just yet. Let me speak to our head of the dispatching department and get back to you. Or if you can always get me this exact firmness of avocados, I don't want to make that exact commitment, but here's what we do. People appreciate that. They respect it. It makes the conversation meaningful. And then the final thing, which I had said, was create value. Once they've taken the time and shared some information with you, if you have any information that's of value to that customer, share it with them. So let's say the person said, my pain point is the price of eggs have gone through the roof and I don't know what to do and I have a big brunch business and this is really hurting me. You can end that by saying, listen, and by the way, John, thanks for taking the time to speak with me. Just to give you some insight, I think the egg market will be coming down in the next week or so. I don't have visibility beyond that, but if you can keep your inventory tight, you should get some relief on the pricing. Or I don't know if you know, but there was a very bad rain in California. It's impacting XYZ produce. Always try to give information so that the person who has taken their time to consider doing business with you comes away with some value if it's possible. And then, of course, as always, get consensus. So this sounds great. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get together a price list and I'm going to circle back with you on Monday. Or I'm going to email you this, circle back on Tuesday. So to wrap up this entire podcast, because we covered a few different subjects, but I want to make this as clear and as valuable for a business purpose as possible. In business, communication is a tool to achieve a desired objective. We as individuals have an enormous impact on how successful our conversations will be by being aware of our impressions or our perspective, by being active listeners, by using the appropriate tonality, by being clear-headed in what we want to achieve, by getting consensus back from the people with whom we speak. These are all within our power. And so that's why studying or reading Stoicism was of value to me with respect to this aspect of my business. And that's why as business leaders, while hard work is essential, focus is essential, I think obsession is a positive. Don't underestimate the value that you bring to your organization with some of the other activities you do in your life. Everything is a learning experience. Business is a creative endeavor. Business is an endeavor that requires all of the faculties of our intellect and our insights. Don't limit your thinking. Don't listen to some of these, in my mind, simple-minded hucksters that are just trying to get you to take a sales course or buy their program no. Be open-minded, be self-aware, be thoughtful, be courageous in being exposed to new information, and then be focused. So as always, this conversation, and I view it as a conversation, was a byproduct of emails that I received. I always love it to hear from people. So if you have anything additional to share, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can reach me at Woolco Foods, Stephen@woolcofoods.com. You can DM me at Woolco Foods. I always love to hear from everybody. Makes it very valuable to me, and would love to hear what you thought of the podcast. If you enjoyed it and it was valuable, please like, subscribe, give a comment. And beyond that, I want to thank you, and I want everybody to please have an awesome day.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toboroff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.